How are you today?
I am great, thank you. And I can't match your energy, your charisma, but I'll
No,
try.
look at that smile. That is, I mean, your energy is oozing out of the microphone, oozing out of the camera. This is fantastic. Well,
Right on.
there's really so many things that I want to talk to you about today. First and foremost, we were connected based, I mean, on you being a leader at the Hypoxico facility. And ever since then, many of my clients have been training hypoxically, and I've seen so many benefits in these clients who have either now are breathing through a mask or training in chambers, or even have room conversions. It's unbelievable, and I mean I can't even begin to list the benefits. I want you to tell me your story as far as how you first became connected to the benefits and just the concept of altitude training, whether it is altitude training in the mountains and or
Yeah,
using the hypoxic equipment through Hypoxico.
sure. Yeah. So I was at an undergrad physiology program at Syracuse University not long after I retired from the Marine Corps. And I heard of a study abroad program in Nepal with the physiology department director, Tom Broussard, Dr. Tom Broussard. And it was going to be the human response to high altitude. So the students that were accepted in the program would be basically the subjects of the study. It was a month-long trek from Lukla, Nepal, through the historic trekking route that Tenzing Norgay and many of the other Everest summiteers trekked through Nepal to get to Everest Base Camp, which is the beginning of the start of the summit. And we would take that trek, and during that journey, we would test, hematocrit levels. We would test different biometrics to see, how people were responding to the altitude. So as soon as I saw that brochure, that pamphlet on, hey, you can go to Nepal, you can be a subject in this study, you get to do the Everest Base Camp trek. I was sold. So I applied, I was accepted, and in the pre-departure studies, they had one of the first installed Hypoxico K2 commercial systems in the physiology lab. And so we got to bike at a simulated altitude of 12,000 feet. We did our VO2 max testing, and we did some other lab testing prior to our departure. And it just really kind of like captured my attention, not only the idea of going to Nepal and doing the trek, which that was a journey in and of itself, but just even the lab portions of, wearing the mask and just breathing this reduced oxygen concentration and attempting to perform physical exercise in that environment. It was fascinating. And I've always been somebody that was drawn to a physical and mental challenge. So it was like, it just fit, and I fell in love with it.
It's really fantastic. So really you were introduced to the concept of altitude training in an academic setting, which is so exciting. I mean, being in your,
Yeah.
in that like very inspired academic, young, just, the world is your oyster, and, and starting to experience it at that point. What a wonderful experience. And you probably got so much out of it. And tell me about the conclusions of that study, of that trek.
Yeah, so it was really fascinating because one of the things we were looking at was, what are the markers for who might not suffer from acute mountain sickness symptoms? Are there, certain demographics, whether it's age, gender, race, ethnicity, what are some markers that might indicate who would suffer from acute mountain sickness? And I guess going into it, as the PhD level researchers were explaining, there really isn't a lot to say who will and who won't. You could have a really fit athlete that suffers significantly. You could have an unfit, relatively, let's just say, unwell person, or unfit, not unhealthy, but, someone who doesn't exercise, doesn't go out of their way to take care of themselves necessarily, and they may not suffer at all. So it was really fascinating in the beginning of this thing to say, wow, I wonder how I'm going to feel. Because it's the one time where my fitness and the idea of being somebody who's physically capable isn't going to insulate me at all from potentially failing to feel good and even be prohibited from continuing at some point. So that was really fascinating. But what the ultimate, sort of big picture determination that contributed to the larger body of evidence was that the at-risk population is mostly young males, primarily because they're inclined to have maybe a bigger ego, and therefore ascend faster. And particularly on multi-day ascents, you don't have the ability to recover. So it's not like you're going to ascend for a day hike and come back down to sea level. You're ascending in a multi-day trek, and your body is never going to come back down to a lower altitude where it can recover sufficiently. So that tendency to move faster and outcycle your body's ability to get adequate oxygen and recover can be the catalyst for acute mountain sickness symptoms and maybe even some more severe complications at altitude, which was really pretty fascinating, eye-opening, and also relevant to how I would have been in my 20s.
Absolutely. That is really so fascinating. And I would have guessed that one of the hypotheses from the PhDs who were leading the research would be, okay, the individuals who have higher hemoglobin levels or have trained hypoxically or have experience with altitude may be less at risk for experiencing mountain sickness. And did they see it? So they saw no difference. And were there individuals who were not only fit athletes, but who also had any level of, did they have a group that had a level of experience with altitude training?
Not really. Some folks had maybe, done some basic mountaineering, some, moderate level altitude exposures before, but nobody had any consistent hypoxic training. Not with breath work and certainly not with, normobaric hypoxic equipment or any hypobaric equipment. So we were all complete novices in terms of exposure.
Yeah, really interesting. And so I wonder, then the comparative study would be, then a group of individuals, all of whom have trained at at least, 6 to 8 weeks or longer, in a
Sure.
hypoxic chamber. Then look at those individuals and see who's most at risk. Maybe it's still the young men.
I wonder. Yeah. I feel like, I don't know, it's a little bit comical and also like, damn it.
I know, exactly. Calm that ego down. Calm that ego, calm
Yeah.
that testosterone. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. You
Yeah.
wonder if, of course, now when you say young men, what are the other components of young men, that are higher than those other populations? Well, testosterone,
Totally.
muscle mass, hematocrit levels, like
Yeah.
interesting, just looking at those. And I'm sure maybe that was talked about in the paper, but that's such an interesting way to be introduced.
Yeah. It was awesome.
Yeah,
So, and we tested hematocrit levels. Obviously those did increase over the course of the month. And I wish I remembered numbers and specific values. We tested brain blood flow, cognitive function. I remember, we didn't do it at base camp. We stopped at one of the last tea houses with the brain blood flow study and the cognitive evaluations. But I do specifically remember feeling slow and just much slower and much less accurate performing simple tasks with cognitive evaluations on a computer, where there would be a word spelled out. So the word would be blue, but it would be in the color green. So it's spelled out blue and it's written in the color green. And the task would be either to read the word or to say the color that it's written in. Does that make
It
sense?
absolutely makes sense. Really interesting. Yeah, and you found that that was
Yeah,
very
and
much more
so
difficult to
it's
process.
simple if your entirely, you know, brain is oxygenated. And I think, I don't remember what my score was, but I felt like I probably got 8 out of 10 wrong, you know. And not only that, I think, I don't know if that's true. I mean, but it just felt slow and
Right.
inaccurate. And I thought, yeah, maybe they're just going to say, Chad, we just called a helicopter and you're going to go back to Blue
This is
Claw
an absolute
and,
emergency.
go home. And we're actually going to, you know, we're going to check your pulse while we're at it too,
Right,
to make
exactly.
sure that you're still with us.
Wow. Well, that is, that is so fascinating to me. And I also would love to hear about the results in terms of measuring cerebral blood flow and also the, the results from the cognitive evaluations, because I think one of the most fascinating areas in the world of intermittent hypoxic trainer that, in my opinion, is still way underexplored is the, is the benefit for the brain. And I know probably the viewers, the listeners, they're thinking, but you just said that Chad just said that he was slow when his brain was at
Right.
reduced oxygen. So don't imagine that you're sprinting on a treadmill and you're sprinting at a 15% incline, 9 miles an hour, and I ask you a question, are you going to be able to answer it? Probably not in the moment, right? Because the
Right.
body's under extreme stress. There is reduced
Yeah.
oxygen in the brain, even in that moment. There's major blood flow to the muscles. Blood flow is reducing in other areas, reducing temporarily from the brain. We're getting mild hypoxia even from high intensity exercise. And so in the moment, our body is under stress. And so temporarily we're experiencing that negative, that decline in cognitive function. And so don't you think if we dose that appropriately, that our body is going to adapt positively, pro-adaptive response to those temporary, the temporary stressors, and then they become good stress as long as they're not chronic, right? And so I wouldn't
Right.
ask a client to run at a 15% incline, 9 miles an hour, 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. That would prove, to cause maladaptations versus,
Right.
if you're dosing the altitude training correctly, amazing, pro-adaptive effects in the brain. I mean,
Yeah.
even in terms of Alzheimer's, I mean, even in some of these studies where they're seeing reversal of the certain components of Alzheimer's, like amyloid beta plaques in the brain. And it's really, really, really fascinating. I know we're just getting the tip of the iceberg here, but this brings me to my next question, and I will in the future ask you more about the results of the cognitive aspects of the study. But
Sure.
I really want to go into this because, Chad, I think this is where your story can have a huge, like a profound impact on a lot of listeners and viewers. A lot of
Right.
individuals have suffered concussion, and they have tried many modalities of treatments, and for some, there are many who feel like, I don't know what my doctor's telling me this, but I'm not improving. And please tell me your story. You're someone who has
Yeah.
suffered concussion, and you have figured out a formula that really works for you. And both of us know that there's many elements of hypoxic training that actually increase neurons in the brain and improve cognitive function. And so tell me your relationship with all
Yeah.
of those things, your story, and how you've modified your training, and what kind of a program protocol you've put yourself on to manage that.
Yeah, that's great. So my story basically is, I spent a career as a Marine, mostly as an artillery officer. So it's you can imagine there's concussions that are from, outgoing, blasts, and I don't know, without boring you with details of technical components of artillery.
Not boring.
Yeah, there's a lot of, there's an overpressure off the end of the muzzle of a large artillery piece, and at times, particularly in combat, you violate safety procedures for the purpose of accomplishing the mission, and so we did that from time to time. Um, but then in follow-on deployments, we became provisional units to fill roles as military police or as infantry units. And during those roles, we were providing, whether it was dismounted patrols on foot or mounted in vehicles. And the environments in Iraq and Afghanistan were, they were IEDs were the signature weapon in both of those theaters. So, I was multiple times subconcussive and concussive blast events that, caused some hearing loss and also like some history of blast concussive injuries. So I do have a traumatic brain injury diagnosis. And that leaves me with chronic migraines and some other issues that I deal with. What I found, and I noticed this, I was in, Colorado for 3.5 weeks this summer. And what I noticed, and I was talking to a gentleman at the laundromat actually about what is it about Leadville, about being up here at 10,200 feet that feels so fantastic about everything. I mean, and he was a really interesting guy, and he's an engineer. So it wasn't as if it was just, some random person without an education, but his idea was like, well, it's just, there's less oxygen, there's less atmospheric pressure. It's like, you're just lighter. Everything's lighter. You don't have this weight on you of the atmosphere at sea level. So that's an idea. But obviously, as you said, with our systems, they're normobaric hypoxia. So there's just a reduced oxygen concentration. What that does scientifically, I don't really know. But there's certainly a concept of neuroplasticity. There's certainly a concept of creating new pathways in the brain. Like you were saying about when I said, hey, it was really difficult to perform these cognitive tasks in a reduced oxygen environment. But what if forcing yourself to do that for certain periods of time in that reduced oxygen environment is actually training for the brain so that in an enriched oxygen or a normal, 20.9% sea level oxygen environment, wow, now you have a different capacity. It's the same as training your body physically in the reduced oxygen environment. So I think that's where it's helped me. If I'm in our chamber at the office and I'm doing a simulation on the treadmill and my colleagues walk in, or Brian, my boss, who's also a great friend and a fantastic guy, walks in and asks me a question, and it takes me 5 minutes to sort of stutter through an answer and he helps me get there. That's brain training, that's cognitive training, that's neuroplasticity. Same thing if I'm home and a friend or a girlfriend or my phone rings, it's not like you can't answer these calls and questions. You might be a little slower and you might say to the person, hey, I'm on my bike right now. I'm on my bike trainer. I'm at a simulated altitude of 8,000 feet. I've been doing this for an hour. My pulse ox says I'm at 84% blood oxygen saturation. That's low for anybody who's normally at 99. But I think, AJ, if that answers your question, to me, that's the it of it. You're really training your brain in these doses that are small, but enough to then, when you're in the oxygenated environment that's normal, you've created these different pathways and helped the neuroplasticity to kind of recover some of what was lost, because there's definitely a degradation after having multiple exposures to overpressure. I know it, the neuropsychologists know it. I can see it. I've tested for it.
Absolutely. It's really exciting to hear you talk about it and also hear about the amazing feats that you've accomplished, like being to Leadville several times and all of the numerous other competitions that you've succeeded at. And I think it's just incredible and also unbelievable that more individuals don't know about using hypoxic training for brain function. And we know scientifically how it's working now. Does that more research needs to happen, of course, to support these statements, but we have seen in several studies that cerebral blood flow certainly increases, right? It also increases with slow breathing, by the way. When we tap into that vagus nerve and, slow the breathing down, carbon dioxide rises in our body, and then we also increase cerebral blood flow. So I'm really interested also, on a side note, in performing testing where we combine the slow breathing with the hypoxic chamber, but that's next year. Exactly. There's a lot of other projects along the way, but I think it's really fascinating that we see in this MRI imaging improvements in entire cerebrovascular functioning in its entirety, and also the activity of the antioxidant system in the brain as a result of temporarily reducing the oxygen, because of course, when we reduce oxygen in the moment, our body is stressed. And so, free radicals, reactive oxygen species, they are increasing. And so what does our antioxidant system do? It's like, I need to up my defense system so that I can battle, the reactive oxygen species. And this is happening in real time in our brain. And so I think that's something also that you experience when trying to read the word blue that is in the color green, that oxidative stress that's in the brain from reduced amounts of oxygen, and then by training a crossword puzzle or attempting to read, in another language, or learning a dance combination, or all of these things that have also been shown to prevent cognitive decline, increase BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factors, so that we are increasing the size of our hippocampus in our brain and birthing new neurons in our brain at all ages, like these studies on the elderly. I love reading studies on ways, to enhance cognition. I have a lot of elderly clients who are always asking me to include elements of cognitive training in their program, whether it's, reactive training with boxing or tennis, or even some learning a dance combination if they're into it, or some kind of agility pattern with their feet, but some level of reactive ability. So I'm tossing the ball at them very quickly and they need to react, and combining it with either some level of breath training to bring them to mild levels of hypoxia if they don't have a hypoxic chamber, or, actually being at altitude and performing these. Now, of course, I'm not doing anything too dangerous, like throwing a 10-pound medicine ball at them while, the oxygen is reduced in their brain, because that would just be dangerous. But, I've started to get really experimental with the cognitive aspect, because that's such a high demand for my clientele to be as sharp, or even get sharper with age. And, when I'm dealing with a 74-year-old man who's I'm still running, a worldwide business, and I want to be not only as sharp, but sharper than the new people who I'm bringing into the company, because I'm still leading this company. Bring into me some elements into the program that are going to keep me sharp. And so he, you helped install his chamber. He is someone who is training at altitude while performing cognitively challenging activities, whether that be foot agility patterns, reactive, in his warm up, punching the arm out only on the 7th jog. Okay, now we're doing on the 5th jog. Now we're pulling the band on count 11. I work a lot with numbers, or we'll do a boxing combination where I'm okay, your address divided by 2 times 3 at altitude. And he has to punch that many times, and he has his boxing gloves on, and of course he's performing it much more slowly in the moment because he's at altitude, and, his blood oxygen is, 85%. But then we practice, and we do also practice it in normoxia, so that he can feel the difference. He's oh wow, that's really fast. Now I do, and he's such a numbers guy. So to be able for him to see and feel those numbers, it's really exciting. So I've witnessed this anecdotally so many times with clients.
Oh, cool.
And it's so exciting. And I remember also thinking about all of the individuals who don't have access to hypoxia or altitude training. And I think that's something that all of us practitioners, coaches who are in the altitude training space, we deal with, knowing the incredible benefits of training at altitude, training in hypoxia, but not everyone having access in their home, having access to the equipment. And so, that's a couple of years ago when I was working on my graduate thesis, I I was really inspired by the French physiologist Xavier Warrens, who did a lot of work with his athletes. Maybe you're familiar with him on the, he does a lot of breath work to actually create the hypoxia in the body, where he has his athletes perform an extended exhalation, and then on the breath hold perform, like 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 80 paces or running 40 meters actually on the breath hold, but on the exhalation, so that the body actually is getting to like 85%, blood oxygen levels, versus many years ago, famous swim coaches used to think that their swimmers were training hypoxically because they were holding their breath while swimming, but because they were performing the swim on the inhalation, because of the oxygen in their lungs, they actually weren't becoming hypoxic whatsoever. So it's really interesting, doing the breath training. And I always want to mention that because I think that many listeners and viewers will think, wow, that's really great, but how am I achieving this, at home? And so there is a level of hypoxic breath training that you can employ. Now, a lot more research needs to be done in that area, because when you perform the hypoxic breathing, you're only becoming hypoxic for very short periods of time, but performing it many, 15 to 20 times within a session. But the cool thing about it is that it's not just a theory, and that, in Xavier Warren's work, he actually did conclude that there were many adaptations in the body as a response to just the breath training to hypoxia, which is really cool, like increased anaerobic metabolism, increased recruitment of type fast twitch muscle fibers, what else did he find? Increased muscle buffering capacity. So, improvements in performance for athletes. Now, that's just scratching the surface, because, knowing that the breath training can bring you hypoxic, great for athletes. Now, what can it do? Can it have any of the positive effects on brain function that we know that traditional altitude training, like, hypoxic training and also going to the mountains, can also have on the brain? We do know that we increase cerebral blood flow with, slowing the breath down, and that the brain does become mildly hypoxic in free divers who perform breath holds. And so I think it's a really interesting way to open the door to, more individuals having access to hypoxic training,
AJ, one note here on the TBI or the concussions, particularly for the demographic of people that would be like me with veterans, there's almost always a comorbidity of PTSD. And so with your breath work specifically, you're taking the body from the sympathetic to the parasympathetic, right?
In most cases, I won't dive too deep into it, but yes, simply by slowing the breath down, you increase activation of the vagus nerve. Acetylcholine is released as a neurotransmitter and immediately slows the heart rate down. And yes, more parasympathetic for the most part, unless we're doing like the breath holds and we do have doses of sympathetic response, which the body usually homeostatically responds to with a parasympathetic response after. So I know I'm getting kind of like geeky on you, but yes, for like large, yes, we're working on improving the autonomic nervous system by using the breath training.
If we're going like a 2-second inhale, 8-second exhale, we're predominantly working towards going into a parasympathetic or rest and digest state, correct?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So that's huge for me, because part of that history of concussion, it also exists with a post-traumatic stress component. Those symptoms overlap. It's often hard to figure out what part is result of concussion, what part is result of post-traumatic stress. So there's really some great overlap there for somebody who has a concussion that was also part of a pretty traumatic experience. The breath work overlaps in that way. And I just thought,
Thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that's so important for the people who are really interested in this particular episode. It's for those who have also suffered concussion or know someone who has suffered concussion. And, I was looking at the numbers, from, the war that you were in. I think the numbers were up to like 400,000 or more individuals came out of that war with concussion, like long-term concussion and concussive symptoms, and it's
Yeah.
normal for, 30%, 30 or 35% of individuals who have suffered concussion to have to manage long-term symptoms. So it's actually really common once you've had a concussion, don't feel like there's something wrong with you if you're like, why am I still feeling symptoms? It's actually pretty darn common at numbers as high as 30, 35%. And so having tools in your toolbox to be able to rely on that ultimately make you a healthier individual anyway, because once you integrate breath training for your autonomic nervous system into your life, if you end up discovering endurance training, which helps with your concussive symptoms, if you end up, training hypoxically, all of these things are going to have massive benefits on other areas of your body as well, and help prevent a heart attack or, a an ankle sprain or, musculoskeletal, circulatory. It benefits every single part of the body. And so, I think the silver lining, and I always talk to, clients about this who maybe have suffered an injury. Okay, the silver lining is now that part of your body very well, and you are going to
Yeah.
become stronger around that joint than you've ever been before, because you're going to add all of you, because you are going to succeed and you're going to rely on those new tools in your toolbox. And it's really exciting. Yeah, the
Yeah.
autonomic nervous system, it's really, and something else that's fascinating about the breath training, and thank you for bringing this up, Chad, because this is the first time that I thought
Sure.
about this in terms of post concussion, traumatic brain injury, looking at raising your carbon dioxide threshold and what that does to your resting state anxiety, and how much you are triggered throughout the day based on how sensitive your chemoreceptors are. Now, I believe that hypoxic training, traditional altitude training, will also lessen the sensitivity of the chemoreceptors in your brain and in other areas of your body, which is, for those who don't know what the chemosensitivity is, that is ultimately our receptors in our body that are sensing our carbon dioxide levels. And when the carbon dioxide levels in our body get too high, then we get a trigger. We get a trigger to take an inhale. Usually it's a diaphragmatic trigger. Any free divers who listen, you understand that very, very well, because over time you raise that threshold as to when you're triggered. And that has been shown for, decades and decades of research. I mean, even psychologists and psychiatrists looking at the carbon dioxide training from breath training, and how that can help with anxiety and depression, because of the way that you relate to anxiety, to those triggers throughout the day. So it's kind of like, putting yourself in a state where you're very uncomfortable and you're doing a breath hold and you feel those carbon dioxide levels rising and you have like massive anxiety and panic in the moment, but you flooded your fears, and then you let it go, you recover, and you just do the appropriate dosing of that. And then you're over the course, usually between 7 and 14 days of performing that breath work, your body starts to adapt and your carbon dioxide threshold rises, and then you have less state anxiety throughout the day. And so I think that's a really fantastic point for, for anyone who has an imbalance in their autonomic nervous system and is resting too much in their sympathetic nervous system as a result,
Totally.
of the, of the concussion and the post-traumatic stress associated with it.
Yeah.
It's
Cool.
so fantastic. This has been amazing, Chad. I really would love to train you at some point on another episode.
Please.
I would love to invite you back, and I would love
Please.
to actually give this, first of all, do a carbon dioxide threshold test, look at some of the testing, and maybe even you have your blood, your pulse oximeter, and we can do some testing as to how hypoxic you get, even just doing the hypoxic breathing, because I think you would be a really interesting one, because you have trained at altitude so much and you've adapted. So I'm assuming that the extended exhalations would not bring your oxygen quite as low as another who, hasn't performed it. But I think the interesting thing for component for you, and a new component, would be the carbon dioxide training, because traditionally when you're training at altitude, your ventilation increases, right, rate per minute, based on your natural response to altitude. And so ultimately what we're doing here is we're slowing the breath down, and so we're purposefully raising the carbon dioxide and even raising the lactate in the body while performing certain exercises. And it's a really neat way to add a level of intensity, even to some lower intensity. So it's actually been argued that by performing hypoxic hypercapnic training using breath holding, you can actually have a recovery day for your joints and not put as much impact and compression on them, but use the breath training
Right.
instead to spike the lactate, spike the carbon dioxide, increase those hydrogen ions that our body does then adapt to, and so it's just a kind of an interesting concept, and I would love to try it on you. I think that would be really, really
Yeah.
interesting.
I'm game 100%. This has been great. Thanks so much,
This is
AJ.
so fantastic. I know that many individuals are going to benefit from listening to your story and feel so inspired. Someday we will have this big altitude training space that's available to everyone in the world, and we're going to combine breath work with altitude training, and there's
Love
going to
it.
be one in your city, and we're all going to be able to go there and use it for health and fitness and longevity, anti-aging, for cognition. I'm going to keep harping on this cognition. It's so exciting. Well, I am so inspired by you, Chad. Thank you so much for being here today. Everyone, Chad Althiser. You can find him on Instagram. Actually, he has this amazing Instagram. He posts about his adventures. He's Kaizen LLC. That's Kaizen LLC. Find him on Instagram. I'm sure you can find him in other places as well. He's done some amazing, amazing things. So exciting. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. I'm going to see you at the next one. I'm going to see you at the next one when we train together. Thank you,
Thanks, AJ.
everyone. Thank you, all the listeners and the viewers. So exciting to be here with you, and keep on achieving inner altitude.